Queen's Gambit, the idea generally is that the habits is coming with an order, and those rules, they include this idea that you move the white in a way that appears as if your white player is making a sacrifice, and the sacrifice from their game pieces in order to basically gain a better position. And for me, it was a realization. There is so much in common of the things that this kind of talks about and the things that I do right now in my work in terms of some conversation around how we're doing manual testing, exploratory testing, automation, whatever we're doing. Like there seems to be these, feelings of personal sacrifices even. That, if I have to, first do some manual testing, if I'm an automation engineer, if I have to do some manual testing, it's kind of like, beneath my abilities and my skills and my title. I get that sense a lot. But also there's been this big conversation around the idea that automation might be taking away time from the actual results that we should be having. And we've actually used more time, I think, in arguing about whether it's this or that than doing this or that in general, because we do that in scale by many, many people. And my general wish is that we would use that time rather on doing things. But on Queen's Gambit, we have this idea that the white is making an opening, which appears to include a sacrifice. And in the same way, then that allows us to get a better position. And automation is very much the same in terms of this Automationist Gambit. So imagine going into a project with skills of both really good exploratory testing. You're able to go up that results gap, I think, in terms of results gap. Like we have the invisible list of bugs that none of us in the project know of, right? If we knew, if our developer colleagues knew, or if we knew where the bugs were, wouldn't we just give them the list and make it easy for all of us so that they could avoid it? But we don't have that list. That list is invisible. So there's this results gap. Sometimes it's smaller when you have a really, really good team. It's smaller in the sense of you get surprises, kind of like, I don't know, how did you ever manage to code this bug in? But look at it, it's fascinating. That's my life. But sometimes my life looks like, oh, there's a pizza box again there in the middle of the living room floor. And I do not want to be picking that up. And in that case, I would rather have my developer colleagues run maybe even automation they created themselves for the sloppy leaving trash around, instead of expecting that that's something that a human would do for them. So there's these two kinds of things. Automationist Gambit suggests that when we do that results gap, maybe even the higher level of the results gap, we would start with automation first. Instead of first making a list, exploring without any constraints or limitations, what if we started with automation? If that was possible, what would it look like? And that's what I want to show you a little bit more on today. So I find, I already kind of mentioned this, but I find that we use a lot of time on talking anti-automation still in the community. I don't know if it is the local community here that does that too, but the global community definitely is still big on correcting people when we get excited about automation. And I say we because I do get excited about automation. I'm more excited about results, but automation is kind of cool. Actually, it's really nice to have around. And it's really nice when you can kind of leave the organization, leave your team, and you can leave something that does the work. Not the full work that you would do, but some of the work that you could have contributed beyond just the bug fixes. So when we use time to warn about how automation isn't perfect, because it isn't, I could, spend some time on that here as well. It's actually a way from succeeding with it. So I really want to focus on the idea of how do you go about succeeding and turn the conversations around into the succeeding side. And I believe very heavily that the core to this is what I nowadays call contemporary exploratory testing. Contemporary because, you know, in the traditional way of thinking about exploratory testing, we thought in terms of test design and test execution being inseparable. But what if the separation, so that you have this learning and agency and active role of yourself in making those decisions, what if for those impactful results through that learning, it's not enough that you don't separate test design and test execution, but what if you also need to actually think in terms of not separating that test automation? So usually when we say test automation, we don't think about the manual work of test automation, which is to write that code. And that's actually kind of heavy manual work. Anyone who's done it knows that it is really not something that appears out of thin air. There's, well, you could say blood, sweat, and tears poured sometimes into it. But when it executes, and when it executes so that it gives us the right kind of information that we want, it is really nice and really beautiful thing to have around. So we don't have that kind of the manual versus automated separation there. We have sometimes us attending to the automation when it runs. I find myself often actually, just watching some of our test automations run. Not because I would feel kind of characteristics so that I can do this particular kind of thing that just changed, but I do want to actually attend, with my eyes and my full self into that feature. But I want to leave the setup stuff for the automation, so I might just interrupt it while it's running. Not just watch it, but actually interact with it. So test execution, this whole separation between automated and manual, it makes no sense. So they're actually also, like, if you want, it is something that over time you kind of grow into that. So you can't automate without exploring, you can't explore without automating. But what does this really look like in practice? So I took an example for you. I can't take an example from my work. I don't think that's going to be the most welcome thing in general. So I took an example from one of the training courses that I've been running. And I was just, before starting this talk, I was mentioning to Irja here, we have never met face-to-face before, but we've met online quite a few times. She's done this exercise like maybe 3-4 times now. And it's always different experience. That is very typical. Always great results, but always different results. And building on top of whatever you learned from the earlier times as well. But this exercise, it's not a very complicated one. So there's a web user interface. It's created by Alan Richardson, the evil tester. And the idea with the exercise is that you're getting an application, tell about the bugs. I used to call this catch-22 because there were 22 things I knew that we should find. Nowadays it's catch-24 because apparently there were 2 things that I didn't know that I needed to find that other people found. And over time, spending more time going deeper, putting myself in different kind of constraints with different kind of groups, I've learned that. So you start with Automationist Gambit, and we would basically say that when you have an application where there is reasonable tooling that you can use to automate, instead of playing with it so-called manually, instead of clicking around and figuring out what it does, right from the beginning. It has a sacrifice. It means you need to be slowing down just a little bit to do those clicks with automation. And you need to be kind of inconvenienced in the sense that you don't have that, hand feel of, when I'm clicking, it's speaking back to me. It's telling me what exactly I If you try to automate, you might try something too fancy. You might try to figure out exactly how to create an algorithm that knows everything that you can see on the screen, including how things are color coded. Even if you started with something that doesn't actually show you how the function works. So with the traditional way of testing, what we would usually do is, just go and well, use it, thinking while using it, and we might create some kind of artifacts. We might create something like this, which is maybe you'd like to write a test strategy as output, very typical one for exploratory testing. So somewhere in the middle, after you have already tested some, you might want to write down, what is this? What are the risks? What are we looking at? Being explicit about the risks. So you can use whatever library, whatever language you want. I've ended up writing code so far in, I think, 14 or 15 languages. So I don't really care much about the language, except nowadays, because my team is working on Python and I really want to get deeper on Python. Not just the basic stuff, but actually going deeper. So it's now Python. You don't get a choice because I made my choice for today. And you can choose some web user interface driver library. You could choose Selenium. That should be a natural choice for me right now because I'm recently volunteering with the Selenium project leadership group. So I should show you Selenium. But it wasn't the choice because my team went with Playwright. And I want to also learn more of Playwright. So that's what we go with on the tools. And those tools already give me kind of like an API and an access to the user interface. And I can do something like this. Looking at code in a talk is probably not the favorite thing for all of us to do. But let's see if we can get some focus into that. So you can see here some of the checks. I really love the presenter thing that I can point out. The expected values, kind of towards the end. What are you checking? How many different kind of texts you have there on the user interface? Or you might have the beginning part, kind of get started with on the right page, filling in the right information, clicking on the right button. And it reads kind of like English. I've had multiple groups who have never written a line of code, and in half an hour, well, usually in 15 minutes, they're quite capable in an ensemble, which is my favorite way of working, if I could have a choice, all of us together on a single computer, taking turns who's on the keyboard, who is in control, and the person in control is not on the keyboard. We can write this, and after writing it once, people generally can write it again. It's not that complicated. We learn to identify those selectors very easily. You learn the API quite easily. It's not that complicated if you've never done that before. And if you have, you probably can, remember that by heart. You maybe run this after every single line. I didn't want to kind of take pictures of every single step. I would usually kind of encourage people to first kind of give themselves maybe like 5 seconds or 10 seconds to look at the screen when you do an Automationist Gambit. Because you kind of miss that manual interaction. It's actually not manual, it's your eyes that are interacting. And you might take control of the time, but as you are running it again and again and again, the 10 seconds, the 5 seconds, the 2 seconds, they feel like eternity. And you are going to turn that on. And there's just, very easy ways of just not, adding sleeps here, but just making it run on slow motion and run so that it pops the user interface out. So you would see, most likely, you would see the green result at some point, kind of test passing. You would figure out that the green result, the little icon there, when I ran it on next to the line numbers, That's what you get in Visual Studio Code. The running results are much more impressive in some of the other IDEs, but I'm kind of now used to this one, so I just changed the pictures to match that. But you might also kind of get to the idea that, you know, one test case is not all you will want. So you will probably take the next step, which is to use exactly the same steps. And you will vary whatever the data is. Simple, basic example of where automation is really powerful as documentation. If you need to try all of these different values that we have here on the list, these are from various people. There's some notes of who has done some of these tests. I've kept everything that makes us find a problem around and extended it. So that's why the text is getting smaller and smaller by every single session that I have spent with people. But this finds, I think, 12 or 13 problems out of that catch-22 list. So about half, more than half, can be found just by the Automationist Gambit. And we didn't yet play with the functionality, we only played with the data. We can do the same with the functionality, we can do the same with the environments, we can run these tests across all the different browsers if we want to. And we can get some kind of like extra information that we didn't have available unless we started with that Automationist Gambit. We'll probably see some red. I added some red around because the red isn't, you know, visible enough. Well, it is definitely when you're writing your test, you can see something is failing. The little red on the left-hand side, also the little kind of like overlays of what exactly is failing. You get used to those quite quickly because you will practice. Sounds like exploratory testing, right? It's an awful lot like exploratory testing. And this is automation, supposedly, but it is actually exploratory. And if you want, you could write your tests in BDD style. I think personally that this kind of like reading them in English and then running them, these are executable tests. There's the same things beneath these that make them run. It looks pretty, but it's not as pretty when they're failing. So your tests, especially for your team, you know, the outside reporting, green, everything is fine, is all I want to say outside my team. And the pain within my team, when they fail, I want it to be minimized. And it is not going to be minimized usually if we primarily serve the people who should never be reading them. Depends on your project, whether they will be reading them, but look at them. Do they actually monitor if they actually read them? They will promise they read them, they will promise they write them, but they might not. Again, a great thing to explore. So we kind of looked at this Automationist Gambit. You start from a single line, you see it fail, you see it pass, you start to trust your tools. You have your first test, you maybe parameterize it a little bit by introducing variables. Then you use those variables to put in different kind of values. You will probably start seeing problems at some point, actual problems, real things to report bugs on. You will maybe make sure that the whole spec is included in the tests. Some people forget, they fall into the trap, they forget there was a spec and they don't find the most important bugs, even though they can completely be found this way. So you still need to kind of, you know, juggle through all those different threads, even if you do the Automationist Gambit. It doesn't leave the other things away, it just creates a box from which you are exploring. Maybe, well, guessing more values, the line changes, line breaks, things like that. Maybe you run them over multiple browsers and so on and so on. But the difficult part is, will you keep them around? Will you have them running then after that, when you created them in your CI system? Maybe. You don't have to, but you can. If your tests are passing, if they're failing, you will probably have to introduce something like I'm okay with this failure for, let's say, next 2 weeks, which is the time frame in which we in my team agreed we will fix these problems. And then they are, if you didn't do that by that time, you will see the red. So creating some of those little kind of, they're not really time bombs, but like time presents for your team in remembering that you have some kind of a mechanism of making sure that you don't intentionally leave bugs behind. I'm kind of a big person of the idea of 0 bugs that we know of listed. So going through and fixing them, it's avoiding walking on that minefield and trying to go around all those mines because we have kind of taken them out and cleared the field. Well, we don't have to keep it around. We can be without. So this mechanism, Automationist Gambit, it definitely finds some bugs, but it also misses some bugs. I'm not going to kind of like go through the full list of all the things it misses, but I think the amount that it finds is already quite relevant. And this is leaving behind executable documentation while you were testing, not maybe the BDD style executable documentation, but all of the tests that you can run against the latest version will help you remember what was true the last time you looked at it. And when you have that kind of like, way of fishing for the things that are no longer true, it's not just the bugs that these tests will find for you. It's also the messaging that is broken in your team, the communication where someone forgot to tell you about a relevant change because they weren't thinking of it as a relevant change that automation finds. And that's not something we call maintenance. That's a joyous message that we are actually getting hands-on information of what's going wrong. So we definitely want that. It's not just documentation, it's also, we talked about this idea of, kind of like, running things while you are on your lunch break. Or doing things a gazillion times. You don't want to do that, without some script helping you. So you can extend your reach. You can have something that tells you, you can make like a nice sound effect for the entire office if you ever go back to the office. Or you can make it post on a channel that something is broken. You can alert people, not yourself. If you are the test person in that team, it's not you who needs to know that the tests are now broken. It's whoever broke the things that the tests are talking about that needs to get that information. So you can automate some of that messaging so that you don't have to be always the messenger telling this news. And I find personally, at least, that automation forces me to kind of like look at things like as if it was a magnifying glass. I have to go a little bit underneath the surface. I need to ask a little bit more questions about how is this and why is this and all kinds of, subtle differences that I might let go of as a user. They now become trouble for me when I automate. And that trouble actually, combined with other future trouble, could cause also trouble in the space of the users. We have this moving focus. Moving focus here. In the sense of kind of like, instead of talking about automation versus manual, I would like to talk about attended and unattended things. And it's all about learning. It's all about exploring. And you can explore when you sleep. It is possible, but it would require you to twist your brain just a little bit into thinking, what is the thing that I can make my computer do while I'm doing something else? And there's plenty of those ideas in monitoring, seeing things, running things on multiple times. You don't have to always be around. The example that I gave on Automationist Gambit is kind of on a high level. It's the user interface. It's the easiest one that I can explain to you in a talk. But I also find myself exploring on the level of unit tests. That's actually my current favorite. Pairing with a developer and asking all kinds of questions about particularly error cases, about the domain, how we're modeling the domain, why things are the way they are, while we're building the code and the unit tests. That's also a possibility. And when they have, or my team already has, built some unit tests, I can always take them and just add something on top of them. I can choose not to keep it around. So it's definitely not that exploratory testing is kind of, you know, that little cloud on top. It is the driving force on every single layer. And we need to think, in order to be effective in our projects, we need to think, how could we move something that we think right now as an end-to-end test into a smaller scale? There's this saying that about 80% of bugs that are found in production, so things that users complain about, could be found in a unit test. All of that is our potential of helping the developers explore, or being the developers who explore, which is kind of where my team went. We couldn't find the tester, so we found a new developer, and every developer in my team is now the tester of the team for 2 months in a row. Every one of them goes to the tester trainings that we generally in this industry are being subjected to, and they're happy about it. They said that they wanted this all their life. So it's more like it was somebody else's candy, and this is the first time it was given to them. It depends on what you can do. If you can't code, but you can't think in the user domain, you probably need to learn to think in the user domain. So if you can't test, if you can't know what's wrong, if you can't point that, oh, did you see that bug there? You need to learn that. But also, if you pair up with anyone or ensemble up with an entire team, it's not that you have to be able to do all of this yourself. You can have great ideas even if you didn't know how to turn them into reality. And speaking up about those ideas to the colleagues who have then the skills to turn them into reality, it's a favor to your team. So all of these things are things that we do together. We should be careful what we use our time on. We will have to make choices. You know, you can't do everything every single day. You can't be in every single project and every single thing. You have to share. It's still teamwork. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that the way we split work can be different, and that way of splitting can make us an entirely different organization. And it can make us an entirely different person in recruiting. I'd like to be able to find my tester side colleagues who won't use half of their interview time into telling me how automation is a bad idea. That's probably no longer the best choice, at least where I'm around. But I believe that the industry is actually going into this. Like, you don't have to know all of it. You have to know just enough to have good conversations that are not about against, but about smart choices that we could do with the automation. So, to conclude, we can make a choice how we open our game. We can choose to open with automation. We don't always have to. We can choose to open without automation. We can choose to open without ever touching the keyboard. It might actually be really good when we just look at things and we are not allowed to do anything. People are more creative given constraints. And the only people worthwhile taking those constraints from is yourself. And that's the core of exploratory testing and contemporary exploratory testing. So